Talk to me about depression.
Well, what's interesting about depression is when I was in the life insurance business, when I was in the mortality space, the prevailing, we've now disproven the serotonin hypothesis, but the prevailing hypothesis at the time was that depression was due to low levels of serotonin. This is the whole concept behind SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And we said if you were low on serotonin, you were by definition depressed. And I remember I used to think all the time, well, if the definition of depression is low serotonin, then why are we not trying to raise serotonin? Because that's not what we did.
SSRI does attempt to raise the availability, right? So it's saying keep it in the system so it's available. Don't
Yeah, it doesn't actually really raise serotonin. What it does is it rations what little serotonin you have. And the way that it rations is it inhibits the receptors that uptake
So you're
serotonin.
saying what they should have done is how do you get it to produce more?
So yeah, so you instead of having a full cup of water, you've got a quarter cup of water. So now but it has to last you all day. So you just sip on it all day, instead of whacking it back all in the morning, having a massive emotional response in the morning, and then the coffee being able to the cup being able to fill itself the rest of the way back up. So the methylation of these neurotransmitters, like we talked about, it begins in the gut. Right? I mean, 90% of the neurotransmitter production in our bodies happens in the gut before it travels up the vagus nerve and it goes into the brain and it's secreted by it's not made in the brain, but it's secreted by the brain. And so the supply of these neurotransmitters is heavily tied to this gut-brain axis. And so, certainly depression can begin in the outside environment. There are plenty of traumatic events that can cause people to be depressed, but people that suffer from prolonged depression, I mean, I've had people come in to see me that and I ask them, how long have you been on antidepressants? And they say 15 or 18 years. I mean, my first question is always, when did you think it was going to kick in?
It's a great question.
I mean, when did you think it was going to kick in? And by that time,
it usually helps them just enough that they remain hopeful.
Yeah, that they remain hopeful, which is super sad to me because, I always use this analogy that when I was in grad school, I was getting my second human biology degree, and I had to take all these plant botany courses, which I absolutely hated, but you have to take them to get the degree. Morphology of thallophytes and all this nonsense. But what really struck me about these courses is that anytime there was something wrong in a bush, tree, shrub, right? If you were to actually call a true arborist or true botanist out to your house, and you got a palm tree and the leaves are rotting in the palm tree, they actually won't touch the leaves, the branches, the trunk of the tree. The first thing they'll do is they'll core test the soil, right? And they'll go, you know what, there's no nitrogen in the soil. And then they'll add nitrogen to the soil and the leaf will heal. But we don't think about human beings like this anymore. We've lost so much faith in mankind and so much faith in humanity and the ability of this to heal this. And so when we look at nutrient deficiencies in the soil causing disease all the way up in the leaf, you have to look at nutrient and physiological deficiencies in the body causing issues in the brain. Things that we call mental disease, mental disorders. If you actually boil down the majority of mental disease or mental conditions, they, at their root cause, they are a lack of raw material. Right? They're missing nutrients in the human body, causing the physiology to misbehave. Just like I said, just taking butter away from a bakery chef. Right? It's a single ingredient, but it's a necessary part of so many recipes. If I said you can bake whatever you want, you just can't use butter, even though it doesn't sound like a big deal because it's one ingredient, it would affect so many recipes. When you go into the gut and you deprive the gut of its process of methylation, which is the creation of a lot of these neurotransmitters, you lack supply. When you lack supply, you lack the capacity to create certain mood, and then we call this a disease or a mental disorder or a mental condition where you have ADD or ADHD or OCD or manic depression or bipolar or you're schizophrenic or you're any number of things. You have generalized anxiety or generalized depression. I don't think the human beings break down that bad, and certainly not in the numbers that we have going on in the United States. I think that we have a lack of mental fitness secondary to a lack of nutrients in the human body. And the majority of our diets lack basic nutrients. The majority of our routines lack the capacity to give us the basic physiology so that we don't have a mental condition.
Okay, so to say that super succinctly, if you have depression, there is a nutrient deficiency going on that has to do with methylation. We can do a genetic test and figure out what you're most likely having a hard time creating.
Yes.
Is there one, like, so we talked earlier, there's basically 5-ish buckets that people break down into.
Yep.
Is depression a known of those 5 buckets? Is it a combination of different buckets?
Depression depending, it's a combination of different buckets, but what's astounding is you see people that can't, for example, have a deficiency in SAMe, S-adenosylmethionine, SAMe. So what happens in the human body is we take a normal amino acid called homocysteine. We break this amino acid down into another harmless amino acid called methionine. Methionine goes up into the brain, it quiets the mind, it helps to actually break down neurotransmitters, and it eventually becomes something called S-adenosylmethionine, SAMe. People that have deficiencies in SAMe, that has been linked to depression. I'm not saying that every person that's depressed needs to take something called SAMe, nor am I saying that every person that's depressed has a methylfolate deficiency. But if you look at research into folate deficiency, B-complex deficiency, and SAMe deficiency, you will find enormous correlations between the rate of depression and the rate of deficiency in those specific nutrients, SAMe, B-complex, and methylfolate. And these are highly prevalent in ancestral diets. They are highly absent in the modern diet.
How did we historically get those things in?
Historically, we got them from fruits, cruciferous vegetables, and grass-fed meats. Meat, fish, chicken, eggs, yes, even dairy, and cruciferous vegetables and fruits. But now, a lot of these, and what impairs the ability for us to draw these nutrients out of a lot of fruits, for example, are pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and preservatives. When we first came up with preservatives, they were actually called anti-digestives. But, and then some smart marketer said, well, shit, people aren't going to go to the anti-digestive part of the supermarket, so we need to change that name. We'll call it preservatives. It's just like we spray all of our grains with folic acid in the United States. We spray all white flour, all white pasta, all white bread, and all white rice in the United States is sprayed with the chemical folic acid. You don't have a choice over that unless you buy organic. It is all fortified or enriched. See, they don't call it sprayed with folic acid. They call it fortified or enriched. They don't call it anti-digestive. They call it preserved. So it's really hard for us to navigate this maze. I mean, the food pyramid is the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. I ought to flip that thing exactly upside down.
Because it has people intaking so much glucose?
Because it has people taking in so much glucose and so much high glycemic carbohydrate. I mean, people that eat the most sugar have the highest blood fat. People that eat the most sugar are the fattest because, sugar raises our level of insulin. And the primary role of insulin, yes, well, portion of its role is to actually metabolize glucose and move glucose into the cell. A very large role of the hormone insulin is to block any other form of energy use in the body. And so when sugars are high, insulin is high. When insulin is high, we can't access the fatty acid pathway. So what happens? Fat begins to build up. Well, where's the first place fat builds up? In the blood, in the form of something called a triglyceride. Well, as triglycerides begin to rise, it makes the size of the cholesterol molecule smaller. As cholesterol gets smaller in particulate size, it gets more dangerous. Two people with the exact same LDL cholesterol level, one could be a marker for longevity, and the other one could be a marker for cardiovascular disease, depending on the particulate size of that molecule. Because remember from high school geometry, as the size of a sphere gets smaller, its surface area to volume ratio goes up. So if you had 2 basketballs of cholesterol and you transport fat, triglyceride, around the blood on the surface of these 2 basketballs, and now I add more fat, right? But I only have 2 basketballs. I have to make these 4 softballs. And then I add more fat. I have to make them 8 baseballs. And I add more fat. I have to make them 16 golf balls. And then I have to make them 32 little BBs. I've never changed the amount of cholesterol. I've changed the size of the cholesterol to increase the surface area to carry more fat. And this is why when we eat high amounts of sugar and we have high insulin in the blood and triglyceride builds up in the blood, it starts to make our cholesterol more dangerous. This is why the triglyceride to cholesterol ratio is actually more important than the cholesterol level. And
okay, there's a few ideas here I want to tease out. One, have you seen Lane Norton's video about cholesterol?
no. What does he say?
Well, it'd be better if you'd seen it. I'll do my best, but I may not be able to give you enough specifics. So what he was saying is that the smaller particles penetrate the
Arterial
wall more frequently
and get eaten by a macrophage. Yeah.
According to him, they have less, a smaller amount of cholesterol in them. Yes, I think that's correct. And then the larger ones don't penetrate as often, but when they do, they have a larger deposit of cholesterol. And so that the studies show, according to him, again, I'm just trying to do my best to accurately represent what he said, that it ends up, the literature says that it ends up being a wash, that it isn't the size of the cholesterol that matters. That's as close as I can get you to what he said.
Did you talk about whether or not it was glycated or whether or not?
We'd have to play the clip.
Let's see what Gary has to say about LDL cholesterol. I'm sure it is going to be right in line with all of the scientific literature, and he's not going to embellish, exaggerate, or misrepresent claims at all.
Here's the myth about cholesterol, guys. I mean, I'll tell you this right now. Cholesterol is the most maligned and misunderstood compound in the entire human body.
Actually, it's one of the most studied compounds in the human body with tens of thousands of published research data. I don't know how you can malign a compound also. Can you just imagine poor little cholesterol?
Cholesterol has a horrendous reputation among the average person, for sure.
It has a horrible reputation for, but this is the same guy that I did something on cyanocobalamin, and he was like, he started screaming into the camera, the dosage determines the poison. The dosage determines the poison. Why would you worry about taking small doses of cyanocobalamin when the dosage determines the poison? I said, well, if you believe that the dosage really determines the poison, then I guess you believe in microdosing with mercury. I guess you believe that the fluoride levels that are in drinking water are safe because they're not enough to kill you or poison you at these certain levels. What we have to stop doing is we have to stop thinking about poisoning ourselves or taking micro doses of chemicals. And we have to start not talking about single dose toxicity, but talking about cumulative dose toxicity. Nobody ever got mercury poisoning from a single piece of tuna fish. They got mercury poisoning because they consistently ate mercury-laden tuna fish, and eventually the toxicity level built up and caused harm. You know, I was talking in particular here about cyanocobalamin, hydrogen cyanide-based B12. Can you go to Google while you're on here?
Don't lose our place in that video, though, because he goes on to talk specifically about the
size
cholesterol
of cholesterol
size. Yeah,
Okay.
I would love to understand this better.
Yeah. We'll talk about particulate size and cholesterol. And then, so I was talking about this nutrient. I was like, if this is in your vitamins, throw it out and just find a vitamin that has methylcobalamin, a natural form of B12. So scroll down the section. By the way, we're on the National Library of Medicine at the National Institute of Health here. Scroll down to section 5.3. So there's the component compounds, right? It's made of the cobalt metal. And just click on hydrogen cyanide. So it's made from hydrogen cyanide. So this form of B12 is made from a flammable, acute, toxic, health hazard, environmental hazard. And if you scroll a little bit further down there and go to view more at the bottom.
It's interesting. So the argument here rests on whether the constant exposure to the chemical becomes a problem or not.
Yes, in the micro exposure, it's just like fluoride. You know, we have certain amounts of fluoride in our water.
When I first started researching you sounded crazy to me when you were talking about fluoride, and I was like, uh-oh, tinfoil.
Yeah.
And then so I started looking into it. Like, are there a lot of people saying this? And I just haven't heard it. And there are a lot of people. Now, whether you guys are right or I have no idea.
Just Google fluoride poison study. The National Toxicology Program.
This is from the, okay.
Yeah. They did a systemic review of the scientific research on fluoride exposure. Can you blow it up? Yeah.
I was going to say, if you can read this, then
and
whatever supplement you're on, I need.
Yeah. I'm 53. And neurodevelopmental and cognitive function, health effects in human, blah, 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 blah. Based on hazard classification, this study will actually talk about the inverse relationship in 3,200 municipalities. It will talk about the inverse relationship between fluoride and IQ, so that as fluoride actually went up, IQ actually went down.
Drinking water?
As fluoride in the drinking water went up, IQ went down. The National Toxicology Study actually looked at 3,200 water municipalities, and we know that fluoride is neurotoxic. But they looked at 3,200 municipalities. In these 3,200 municipalities, they found an inverse relationship between the amount of fluoride and IQ. So as the amount of fluoride in the drinking water per municipality went up, the IQ actually went down, especially in prepubescent teens. It talked especially about the incidence of IQ going down in prepubescent teens. I'll find it for you, and we'll link it to the podcast so we don't have to spend all the time. But I will find that report. I actually used it in one of my reports that I did, just a one-on-one with the camera. And again, I'm not trying to like sound the alarm, but if you have the possibility of filtering your water and not drinking fluoride in your water, and also chlorine and microplastics and pharmaceuticals, then for sure, tap water is one of the things I think that you should permanently get out of your life. Like I also think you should permanently get genetically modified foods out of your life.
Yeah, that one.
Right?
All right, so we're definitely going to talk about these. Let's close the loop on cholesterol really fast.
On the cholesterol.
So
I would vehemently disagree with him, and I'd love to see the research that he's referring to.
Let's get specific.
So in the mortality space, and mortality is based on a pool of large data. Right. So when we would predict a life expectancy, it wouldn't be like if I predicted your life expectancy and it said, Tom, you had 272 months to live. It didn't mean in 272 months you would drop dead. It meant in 272 months you had an exact same chance of being alive as you did of being dead. It was the center of the bell curve. Right. It was the median life expectancy. And then to move you to one side of the curve or to the other, we would look at specific risk factors, one of which was your LDL cholesterol over time. And this was based on a pool of 370 million lives. It is the largest population database in the world. So if you had low levels of triglyceride and slightly elevated LDL cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, this was a marker for longevity. If you had elevated triglyceride and low and high LDL, it was a marker for cardiovascular disease. So when you talk about markers for cardiovascular disease, you cannot look at LDL in a vacuum. It is not a linear correlation between increased LDL and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. That is absolutely patently false. If you have increased LDL cholesterol and you have increased levels of triglyceride, your mortality rate skyrockets. If you have increased levels of LDL cholesterol and low triglyceride, your incidence of cardiovascular disease plummets. So there is no linear correlation between LDL cholesterol on its own and cardiovascular disease. And that's what I say.
You're saying that from an insurance predictive model perspective.
An insurance predictive model that was based on actual mortality.
Right.